What would you do if you stood face to face with a billionaire and called him heartless in front of the entire world? That's exactly what Clare Anderson did one morning in the marble lobby of Hale Tower. In that moment, she wasn't just an unemployed woman fighting despair. She became the first person in years to look Jonathan Hale, the most feared CEO on Wall Street, in the eye and refuse to bow. But here's the twist: instead of destroying her, Jonathan offered her a deal. 3 months at his side, 3 months to prove that a ruthless empire could be run with heart, fail, and she would lose her career forever, succeed, and she might just change him and herself. What happens when principle collides with power? When a woman who has nothing left to lose takes on a man who has everything but no one to trust? And what if, in the middle of boardroom wars, late-night confessions, and a family feud threatening to tear an empire apart, love finds a way? Stay with us as we uncover a story of courage, redemption, and the kind of love that rewrites destinies. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe before we begin. The lobby of Hale Tower always looked more like a cathedral than a place of business. 40 feet of polished marble, glass walls that caught the morning light, and a constant hush, as if even footsteps were afraid to echo against all that wealth. People passed through briskly, their designer shoes clicking, voices kept low, every gesture restrained, as though they knew they were moving inside the heart of corporate power. But that morning, the hush was broken. Heartless, incompetent. The words cut through the air like a whip. Every head turned, every phone froze mid-text. Even the barista in the corner coffee stand stopped mid-pour, foam spilling over the rim of a paper cup. At the center of the commotion stood Clare Anderson, her chest rising and falling with the kind of anger that had been building for months. She was tall, 5'8" in worn heels, her dark blonde hair pulled back in a no-nonsense knot that had come undone during her furious march across the lobby. A paper folder, once neatly packed with her campaign notes, now lay scattered like confetti across the marble floor. And opposite her, calm, still, unshaken, stood Jonathan Hale, the man everyone in New York whispered about, the billionaire CEO who could unmake fortunes with a single decision. His suits were tailored to perfection, his silver watch gleamed faintly in the morning light, and his eyes, an unsettling shade of cold gray, looked at Clare with the same detachment one might use on a faulty spreadsheet. The employees gathered in the lobby watched in disbelief. Nobody talked to Jonathan Hale this way. Nobody. Clare's voice rose again, trembling with a mixture of fury and exhaustion. You destroyed 6 months of work because you couldn't be bothered to read the fine print. Do you have any idea how many families you put out on the street? Someone in the crowd gasped. Another whispered, "She's done. She'll never work in this city again." Jonathan didn't move, didn't blink. Only one eyebrow lifted slightly as though her outburst amused him. His voice, when it came, was so low that people had to lean forward to hear it. "Would you like to repeat that, Miss Anderson?" she snapped. "Clare Anderson? And yes, I'll repeat it for you in bold letters if you'd like. You're heartless, you're incompetent, and the fact that no one here dares to say it doesn't make it any less true." The silence that followed was suffocating. A receptionist dropped her pen. A security guard shifted uneasily. Clare's heart was pounding so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. Jonathan took a step closer. He was taller than she expected, 6'2" at least, and the expensive cologne he wore seemed to close in around her. "You do realize," he said quietly, "that no one speaks to me like that in this building." "Maybe that's the problem," Clare shot back. Her voice was shaky, but her chin was lifted. "No one's willing to tell you the truth." For a moment, the gray in his eyes shifted something between surprise and dark amusement. Then he did something that stunned the entire lobby. He smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was sharp, calculating, dangerous. A smile that made seasoned executives squirm in their leather chairs. "Interesting," he murmured. Clare braced herself for security to appear, for the lawsuit, the blacklist, the end of her career. She thought of her empty bank account, of the unpaid rent waiting in her Brooklyn apartment, of her sister Lauren's text messages asking if she was holding up. This was it. She had just detonated the final bridge she had left. But Jonathan's next words knocked the air out of her lungs. "Congratulations, Miss Anderson," he said smoothly. "You've just earned yourself a job." The crowd rippled with confusion. Claire blinked. Sure, she'd misheard. A job? He slid his phone into his jacket pocket as if the matter were already decided. "Clearly, I am, as you so eloquently declared, incompetent. So, you will work for me. 3 months. You will teach me how not to be incompetent." Claire's stomach dropped. "Absolutely not. I wouldn't work for you if he leaned in." Voice barely above a whisper. "You'll want to, Miss Anderson. Because if you refuse, I will make certain that not one agency, not one firm, not one consultancy in this country will ever hire you again. Your career will end before you step out of this building." Her mouth went dry. The threat was quiet, but it was real. Men like Jonathan Hale didn't bluff. She looked around. Dozens of eyes were fixed on her, waiting to see if she would crumble. Jonathan extended his hand as though offering a perfectly polite agreement. 3 months. If by then I remain the most heartless, incompetent executive in America, then perhaps you were right. But if you succeed, his eyes glittered with a challenge. If you succeed, you'll have proven something no one else has managed in over a decade. Claire stared at his hand, her pulse roaring in her ears. It felt like shaking hands with the devil. Finally. With every nerve in her body screaming, she reached out and grasped it. His grip was firm, colder than she expected. He held it just a moment longer than necessary. "Welcome to your worst nightmare, Miss Anderson," he said softly. The lobby exhaled as if the entire building had been holding its breath. Phones were lifted again. Whispers swirled like smoke. By the time Claire pulled her hand back, she knew nothing about her life would ever be the same. She had gone from being an unemployed, angry ex-director to the most unwilling employee in New York, all in less than 5 minutes. And Jonathan Hale, the man she had just insulted in front of half of Wall Street, was smiling as though he had won. Brooklyn always felt louder when Claire had nothing left to hide behind. The traffic on Flatbush Avenue, the shouts of teenagers playing basketball in the cracked court across the street, the constant rattle of the subway beneath her apartment, it all pressed in when she shut the door behind her that evening. Her apartment was a walk-up on the 4th floor of a building that had seen better decades. The paint on the banister was peeling, and the elevator had been under repair for so long that neighbors joked it was part of the decor. Inside, the space was cluttered, but lived-in fabric swatches from old campaigns pinned to a corkboard, half-finished mugs of coffee on the counter, stacks of overdue bills she kept moving from the kitchen table to the nightstand and back again, as though rearranging them might make the numbers change. Claire kicked off her shoes and dropped her bag on the couch, sinking down beside it with a groan. Her phone buzzed. "Lauren, did you really yell at Jonathan Hale in the middle of Hale Tower? Please tell me this is an exaggeration." Claire covered her face with her hands. Word traveled faster than the subway. She didn't reply. Not yet. Instead, she stared at the manila envelope waiting on her kitchen table. It hadn't been there when she left that morning. Apparently, Jonathan Hale's legal team didn't waste time. The envelope was heavy, thick with paper that carried the weight of inevitability. She pulled it toward her, sliding out the contract inside. The letterhead gleamed Hale Global Holdings. Her eyes skimmed the first page, her stomach twisting tighter with each line. Base salary $240,000 for 3 months. Performance bonus subject to CEO discretion. Non-disclosure agreement, binding in perpetuity. 24/7 availability required. Failure to comply, immediate termination, and forfeiture of compensation. The numbers made her dizzy. In 3 months, she could pay off her credit card debt, catch up on rent, maybe even breathe again. But the conditions read less like an employment offer and more like indentured servitude. She dropped the papers on the table, rubbing her temples. How had her life shrunk to this just last year? She had been a creative director at one of Manhattan's most respected firms. She'd led campaigns that made clients cry at the pitch meeting, ads that people actually remembered. She'd believed in her work. And then one contract. One careless oversight, not hers, but signed off by the very man she had confronted this morning, had destroyed everything. She had been laid off a week before Christmas. 50 people had. She remembered the look on her assistant's face, a young mother with 2 kids. When the news came down, that was the day Clare had promised herself she wouldn't stay silent. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from her landlord, polite but firm rent due by Friday. Ms. Anderson, no exceptions this month. She pressed her forehead to the table. The wood was cool against her skin. She wanted to scream, but she was too tired. Her laptop sat nearby. Its screen cracked at the corner from being shoved into her bag one too many times. She opened it anyway, searching for job postings, copywriter, junior strategist, brand assistant positions she had outgrown years ago. Half of them didn't even respond when she applied. The others sent automated rejections within hours. The truth was simple. Her career was over, at least in advertising. Word got around. People whispered difficult, hot-headed, unprofessional. No one wanted to hire the woman who had publicly called Jonathan Hale incompetent. And yet, here was Jonathan Hale himself, offering her more money than she'd ever dreamed of earning in such a short time. She pushed the contract away again, stood up, paced the small length of her apartment, back and forth, back and forth. Her thoughts collided like bumper cars. If I sign this, I'm selling my soul. If I don't sign, I won't make rent. He's a manipulative tyrant. But what if I could actually make a difference? Clare pulled the blinds open. Outside, the skyline glowed, Manhattan rising across the river like a promise and a threat. Somewhere in one of those glass towers, Jonathan Hale was probably sipping a $12 scotch, certain she'd cave. She hated that he might be right. Her phone buzzed once more. This time, Lauren called, against her better judgment. Clare answered. "Please tell me you didn't." Clare sighed. "I did." A beat of silence, then her sister burst out laughing. "Oh, Clare, only you would pick a fight with the most powerful man in New York before noon on a Tuesday. It wasn't a fight, it was the truth, which makes it even worse." Lauren's voice softened. "Are you okay?" Clare looked at the envelope on her table. Define okay. What did he do? Fire you. Sue you. He offered me a job. Now it was Lauren's turn to fall silent. A job? Yes. 3 months, exorbitant pay, impossible conditions. And you're going to take it? I don't know. Clare's voice cracked. It feels like a trap. Of course it's a trap, Lauren said gently. But maybe it's also an opportunity. You always said you wanted to work on something that mattered. Maybe this is it. Clare swallowed hard. Or maybe it's the end of me. They stayed on the line for a few more minutes, Lauren offering encouragement that didn't quite ease the ache in Clare's chest. When she hung up, the apartment felt even smaller. She sat back down at the table, pen in hand. Her gaze drifted to the pile of Bill's overdue credit card statements. A final notice from her utility company, a handwritten IOU to a friend she'd borrowed from months ago. Her hand shook as she signed the first page, then the second, then all 43. By the time she scrawled her initials on the last line, tears blurred her vision. Clare closed the folder, sealing her fate. She had agreed to work for Jonathan Hale, the man she despised most, the man she had sworn never to tolerate. For 3 months, her life was no longer her own. She pushed the contract away and whispered to no one in particular, "God help me." Jonathan Hale's penthouse looked exactly like the kind of place a billionaire was supposed to live in, gleaming, spotless, almost sterile. The glass walls stretched from floor to ceiling, offering an unbroken view of Manhattan's skyline. At night, the lights below glittered like a galaxy at his feet, but Jonathan rarely looked at them. To him, the view was a measurement, not a marvel. Every building he saw represented competition, potential acquisitions, or unfinished battles. Inside, everything was sleek chrome, granite, dark leather, a dining table that could seat 12 but had never hosted more than one, shelves lined with art books he never opened, a piano tucked against one wall that hadn't been played in over 2 decades. The silence was so complete that sometimes, when Jonathan closed his laptop, he could hear his own heartbeat echoing in the space. His day began before dawn. Edward Price, his assistant of 15 years, emailed a schedule every night, and Jonathan followed it like scripture. Wake at 5:00 a.m., workout in the private gym, protein shake, shower, suit, car, by 6:15. By 6:30, he was already scanning global market reports while his driver navigated the streets below. Every hour of his day was stacked with meetings, calls, negotiations, lunch, if it happened, was often a few almonds from a crystal bowl on his desk. Dinner was usually delivered sushi, eaten in silence while reviewing quarterly reports. When the world slept, Jonathan remained at his desk, pushing himself to stay one step ahead of rivals who circled like sharks. That night, he sat at his kitchen island with his laptop open, the glow painting sharp lines across his tired face. His phone buzzed with messages from London, then Tokyo. He responded to each, efficient and clipped. When a moment of silence finally came, he poured himself 2 fingers of scotch, sipping it without tasting. He glanced toward the piano, that relic of another life, then looked away quickly. Jonathan lived in a fortress of glass and stone, surrounded by everything money could buy except warmth. Meanwhile, across the East River, Clare Anderson's apartment told a different story. Her 1-bedroom walk-up was small, crowded, alive with imperfections. The walls were covered with pinned-up sketches and half-faded posters from campaigns she had worked on in the past, reminders of both triumph and failure. The couch sagged in the middle. The coffee table bore faint rings from too many mugs, and a stack of old magazines leaned precariously in the corner. The kitchen smelled faintly of burnt coffee. A plant on the windowsill reached desperately toward the light, surviving against the odds. The refrigerator hummed too loudly, filled mostly with leftovers, yogurt cups, and a single bottle of wine she had been saving for a victory that never came. That night, Claire sat cross-legged on her bed, a mountain of papers spread out around her. Bills, notices, credit card statements, each one a reminder of how precarious her life had become. She circled numbers, made lists, crossed them out, started again. The math never worked. Her phone buzzed with another text from Lauren. "Don't stay up all night worrying. We'll figure this out." Claire typed back, "Trying to sleep. Don't worry." It was a lie. Sleep felt impossible. She leaned back against the pillows, staring at the cracks in the ceiling. The plaster had water stains shaped vaguely like states on a map, Texas above the window, Florida near the light fixture. She used to laugh about it with friends, but tonight, the stains just looked like evidence of neglect. Her laptop sat on the nightstand, its cracked screen glowing faintly with job postings she hadn't closed. She scrolled absently, the words blurring. Nothing matched her skills. Nothing matched her experience. She was overqualified for half the roles, blacklisted from the rest. Her eyes landed on the envelope again, the contract with Hale Global. The papers she had signed still felt unreal. A golden cage, she thought. 3 months of security, bought at the cost of her pride. She reached for the wine bottle, then set it back down. Instead, she picked up an old campaign notebook, flipping through sketches and slogans that had once filled her with excitement. She remembered late nights at the office with a team who believed in her, laughter echoing over pizza boxes. She remembered presenting to clients with her heart pounding, but her voice steady, watching their faces light up when they saw her vision. And then she remembered how quickly it had all been taken away. Claire hugged the notebook to her chest, closing her eyes. Across the river. Jonathan Hale sat in a glass tower, untouched by the consequences of his decisions. She lived with them every day. The contrast was unbearable. He had a fortress of wealth, polished until it gleamed. She had a cramped apartment held together by grit and stubbornness. He had power over empires. She couldn't even control her utility bills. And yet, against every rational instinct, her life was now tied to his. At nearly the same hour, Jonathan closed his laptop and leaned back, rubbing the bridge of his nose. His penthouse was silent. Too silent. He thought of Claire's outburst in the lobby that morning, the fire in her voice. Nobody had spoken to him like that in years. It unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Across the river, Clare lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking of the coldness in Jonathan's eyes. How could someone so brilliant also be so blind? Two worlds, two lives, colliding now by contract, bound together for 90 days. Neither of them knew what those 90 days would demand or change. The next morning, Clare stood outside Hale Tower, clutching a paper cup of coffee as if it were a shield. The skyscraper gleamed in the morning sun, its mirrored glass reflecting the city around it, dwarfing the brownstone buildings on the block. Even after years of working in Manhattan, she had never grown used to this view. Buildings that seemed less like workplaces and more like monuments to power. The revolving doors spun silently as streams of employees moved in and out, each dressed in tailored suits, moving with the confidence of people who belonged here. Clare hesitated, glancing down at her own reflection in the glass. The charcoal gray suit Jonathan's team had delivered fit perfectly, far better than anything she could afford on her own. And yet, she still felt like a trespasser. Inside, the lobby was the same cathedral of marble and glass where she had detonated her career the day before. This time, though, she was no outsider. She had an ID badge clipped to her lapel, the Hale Global logo gleaming against her jacket. The receptionist, who had nearly fainted during her outburst, gave her a wary smile. Conference room, A, 42nd floor. Mr. Hale is expecting you, the receptionist said. Expecting her? Clare exhaled sharply and forced her feet to move toward the elevators. The conference room looked like something out of a political thriller. A long mahogany table stretched across the space, polished until it gleamed. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Manhattan, and in the distance, the Hudson shimmered like steel under the rising sun. Screens along the walls glowed with charts, graphs, and live feeds of market data. At the head of the table sat Jonathan Hale, immaculate as ever in a navy suit. His tie knotted with mathematical precision. He didn't look up when she entered. Instead, he continued typing on his laptop, the rhythmic click of keys the only sound in the room. "You're 3 minutes early," he said finally, his eyes still on the screen. "I'm impressed. I'm always punctual," Clare replied, taking the seat across from him. She placed her coffee on the table with deliberate calm, even though her pulse was racing. That made him look up. Those gray eyes flicked over her face, sharp and assessing. For the briefest moment, she thought she saw something like amusement. Before she could decipher it, the door opened and a group of executives filed in. Men and women in dark suits, each carrying tablets and briefcases, their faces set in neutral expressions. They nodded at Jonathan with reverence, then glanced curiously at Clare before taking their seats. Edward Price, Jonathan's longtime assistant, entered last, carrying a folder thick with documents. He gave Clare a kind smile that eased her nerves slightly before placing the folder in front of Jonathan. The meeting began. "Let's discuss the Hartwell acquisition," Jonathan said, his voice carrying easily across the room. What followed was less a discussion and more a masterclass in controlled aggression. Jonathan dissected Hartwell Industries' quarterly reports with surgical precision, pointing out weaknesses, inefficiencies, and opportunities with a cold clarity that made Clare's stomach tighten. When Hartwell's representatives raised concerns about employee layoffs, Jonathan dismissed them with a flick of his hand. Redundancies are inevitable in any merger. The only question is whether you want to control the process or let it control you. When someone mentioned preserving company culture, he smiled thinly. Culture is a luxury struggling companies can't afford. Survival comes first. The executives around the table nodded, taking notes, some with visible relief that he was the one making the hard calls. Clare, however, felt her throat constrict. These weren't just numbers. They were people families, mortgages, college tuition payments. She wanted to stand up and shout at them all. Do you hear yourselves? These are lives you're talking about? But she stayed silent, scribbling notes furiously in her leather-bound notebook, her jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. 2 hours later, the deal was done. Hartwell had agreed to sell for 40% less than their asking price. Their executives left the room pale and shaken, while Jonathan leaned back in his chair, entirely composed, as though he had just negotiated the price of a car rather than the future of thousands of employees. Excellent, he said, turning to Edward. Send the usual congratulations basket to their office. The expensive one. Of course, sir, Edward replied smoothly. The room emptied quickly after that, executives retreating to their own tasks. Clare remained in her chair, staring at Jonathan. He looked at her finally, one brow arched. Well, assessment. Her pen froze over the page. She wanted to unleash everything boiling inside her to call him ruthless, soulless, unfeeling. Instead, the truth slipped out in a whisper. You're not incompetent. His lips curved into a faint smile. Thank you for that ringing endorsement. You're brilliant, she admitted, her voice louder now, terrifyingly brilliant. But you're also completely heartless. That made him pause. His smile faded, replaced by something harder to read. Heartless, he repeated. Yes, Clare said firmly, meeting his gaze. You just bought a company and discussed firing people as if you were ordering lunch. These are human beings. Jonathan. They're not just numbers on a spreadsheet. For the first time since she'd met him, his mask seemed to falter. A flicker of something hurt. Annoyance. Maybe even regret crossed his features before vanishing. Sometimes being the villain, he said slowly, means being the one who actually solves the problem. Clare shook her head. There has to be a middle ground between ruthless efficiency and destruction. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Then show me. You have 3 months. Prove that this mythical middle ground exists. Her pulse quickened. It wasn't just a challenge. It was a dare. Fine, she said, closing her notebook with a snap. But don't expect me to stay quiet when you cross the line. Jonathan's smile returned, sharper than ever. Good. This should be interesting. As Clare followed him out of the conference room, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just stepped into a battlefield, one where the weapons weren't swords or guns, but words, numbers, and willpower. And for the first time, she wasn't entirely sure which side she was on. 2 days into her unwanted contract, Clare thought she had seen the worst of Jonathan Hale's style. She was wrong. The boardroom that morning hummed with tension before Jonathan even walked in. Hale Global had its sights on another acquisition this time, a mid-sized manufacturing firm in Ohio that had been family-run for 3 generations. Their machinery was aging, their margins shrinking, but their reputation for craftsmanship remained solid. Jonathan entered the room with his usual precision, flanked by Edward and 3 senior executives. He adjusted his cufflinks as if preparing for battle. Clare sat at the far end of the table, notebook open, already bracing herself. Let's begin, Jonathan said, his voice cutting through the low murmur. The first presentation was clinical spreadsheets, charts, red lines showing losses, blue lines showing projected savings if the company were restructured. In other words, if hundreds of jobs were cut. Jonathan listened with an expressionless face, occasionally tapping a finger against his chin. When the presentation ended, he spoke without hesitation. The path is obvious. We acquire, liquidate the underperforming divisions, and shift production overseas. Net savings $70 million in the first fiscal year. The executives nodded, some relieved, others merely eager to align themselves with his authority. Clare's pen froze over her paper. She waited, hoping someone else would speak. No one did. Finally, she couldn't hold back. You're talking about dismantling a company that's been in one family for decades, she said, her voice sharp in the silence. Do you even hear yourself? Jonathan's head turned slowly, his gray eyes fixing on her like ice. Yes, I hear myself perfectly. What I don't hear is a rational alternative. Claire leaned forward, heat rushing to her cheeks. These aren't just numbers. That company supports an entire community. You cut those jobs, and you're not saving 70 million, you're destroying livelihoods. Schools lose funding, small businesses collapse, families can't pay mortgages. That's not strategy, that's devastation. The air in the room thickened. Several executives shifted uncomfortably. Edward cleared his throat softly, but Jonathan raised a hand to silence him. His gaze never left Claire. "Miss Anderson," he said evenly, "you were hired to observe and advise. But you must understand something. Sentiment doesn't keep companies alive. Profit does. A business that fails to adapt dies. And when it dies, everyone loses." Her hands clenched into fists on the table. "You keep saying adapt, but what you really mean is cut until there's nothing left. That's not adaptation, it's amputation." For the first time, Jonathan's composure cracked, his eyes narrowed, his voice grew sharper. "And what do you propose, that we preserve inefficiency out of nostalgia, that we let loyalty bankrupt us? Business is not a charity. Miss Anderson, it is survival." The clash of their voices rang in the boardroom. Claire could feel every pair of eyes locked on them, but she didn't care. "There's a middle ground," she shot back. "Invest in them, modernize their equipment, retrain their workers instead of discarding them. You call it charity, I call it vision. People don't follow balance sheets. They follow leaders who care." Jonathan's jaw tightened. For a moment, the silence between them was so sharp it felt like a blade. Then, in a low, dangerous tone, he said, "Vision without discipline is chaos. Caring without calculation is ruin. That is why you are here to challenge me. But don't mistake challenge for authority." Claire met his glare, refusing to flinch. Her pulse hammered in her ears, but she held her ground. "Then consider me doing my job." The words hung in the air. "Finally." Jonathan leaned back, exhaling slowly. He tapped his pen once against the table, then addressed the executives as if nothing had happened. "Prepare both projections, one with liquidation, one with modernization. We'll review the numbers tomorrow." The meeting moved on, but Claire barely heard the rest. Her blood still burned from the exchange. Later, in the hallway, Jonathan caught up to her. The others had dispersed, leaving them alone with the echo of their argument still alive between them. "You enjoy undermining me, don't you?" he said quietly, his tone more curious than angry. Claire turned to face him. "I don't enjoy any of this. But someone has to remind you these decisions affect real lives." His eyes searched hers, cool but probing. "You think I don't know that? Do you?" she asked. For a fleeting second, something unreadable flickered across his face. Vulnerability, regret. But then the mask slid back into place. "What I know," he said, "is that hesitation costs lives too. Different lives, perhaps, but lives nonetheless. You see the people in front of you. I see the millions behind the curtain, the investors, the pension funds, the employees of other companies depending on us not to fail." Claire's voice softened, though her conviction didn't waver. "And maybe if you remembered both, you'd be more than a brilliant machine. You'd be human." Jonathan said nothing. His gaze lingered on her a moment longer before he turned away, disappearing into his office. That night, Claire sat at her kitchen table in Brooklyn, replaying every word. Her hands still trembled from the confrontation. She knew she had crossed a line most employees would never dare to approach. But she also knew she had seen something in Jonathan Hale's eyes during that exchange, a flicker of humanity buried under all that steel. He wasn't incompetent, far from it. He was brilliant, too brilliant, and far, far too cold. It was close to midnight when Claire realized she'd left her laptop charger in the office. She cursed softly, pulling on her coat. Without it, she'd lose hours of work tomorrow, and she couldn't afford to be unprepared. Not when Jonathan Hale was watching for every flaw. The city was quieter at that hour. The subway ride into Manhattan rattled and screeched, half empty except for a few night shift workers and students dozing against the windows. When she emerged, the sidewalks of the financial district were almost deserted. The glass towers rose like sleeping giants, their lights mostly dimmed. But at the top of Hale Tower, one floor still glowed. Of course, the security guard at the lobby desk waved her through without comment. Maybe he was used to seeing people return at odd hours. Maybe he already knew who she was. Either way, the silence of the elevators as they rose to the 42nd floor felt heavy, like she was being carried into forbidden territory. The office was dark except for one pool of light spilling from the corner office. Jonathan's office. Claire hesitated. She could just slip in, grab her charger, and leave. But curiosity tugged at her. She walked quietly across the carpeted hallway, peering through the open door. Jonathan sat at his desk, jacket draped over the back of his chair, tie loosened, shirt sleeves rolled up, papers and financial reports sprawled across the polished surface. His laptop glowing with lines of numbers. His hair, usually immaculately styled, looked slightly disheveled, as if he'd been running his hand through it all evening. He looked less like the invincible CEO of Hale Global, and more like a man trying desperately to hold an empire together. "You do realize it's almost midnight, right?" Claire said softly. Jonathan looked up, startled. For a moment, something raw flickered in his eyes before he masked it. "Shouldn't you be at home? Miss Anderson, I came back for my charger." She stepped into the office, folding her arms. "What about you? Don't you have a penthouse to go back to? Or a yacht? Or some secret billionaire lair?" The corner of his mouth twitched, but his voice remained flat. "I have a penthouse, but it's just as empty at midnight as it is at 7 a.m. Claire blinked. The honesty of it caught her off guard. She pulled out the chair opposite his desk and sat down. "So, you just stay here I work." His tone was matter of fact. "There's always something to be done. Tokyo opens in 6 hours. London is already trading. The world doesn't stop spinning just because New York goes to sleep." She glanced at the scattered reports. "Do you do all this yourself?" "My teams handle execution." "But the decisions," he gestured toward the papers, "those are mine." She shook her head in disbelief. "That's insane. You can't personally oversee every detail of a multi-billion-dollar company." Jonathan's eyes narrowed. "Watch me." For a moment, they sat in silence. The hum of the city below seemed very far away. Claire leaned forward, studying his face. In the harsh glow of the desk lamp, she could see the lines etched around his eyes, the faint pallor of exhaustion. He looked human. "You know what your problem is?" she asked quietly. "I'm sure you'll tell me. You don't trust anyone. You micromanage everything because you assume everyone else will screw it up." His jaw tightened. "I've learned the hard way not to rely on people." "What happened?" she pressed gently. He leaned back, staring past her at the dark skyline beyond the window. For once, he didn't look like the untouchable titan of industry. He looked like a man remembering something he'd rather forget. "People let you down," he said finally, "or they leave. Either way, the result is the same. You're alone." Claire's chest tightened. She recognized that loneliness, even if she'd never admitted out loud. She had felt it in her own apartment, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, with no one to talk to but overdue bills. "That's no way to live," she said softly. "It's survival." She studied him for a long moment. "When's the last time you took a real break? And don't say lunch with a senator, because that doesn't count." Jonathan's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, humorless and tired. "I don't take breaks. Breaks are for people who can afford to stop moving." Her voice sharpened. "That's not survival. Jonathan, that's self-destruction." His eyes flicked back to hers, a flash of irritation sparking in the gray. But underneath, she thought she saw something else, fear. "You think I'm destroying myself?" he asked. "I think you already have," she replied gently. "Look at you. alone in this office at midnight, chasing numbers while the rest of the world sleeps. When's the last time you laughed? Really laughed? He didn't answer. His gaze drifted, and his silence was louder than words. Claire leaned back, folding her arms. Exactly. For the first time since she'd met him, Jonathan looked unsettled, not by her anger. He could weather anger without flinching, but by her compassion. She wasn't trying to win an argument this time. She was trying to reach him, and for one fragile moment, the armor cracked. "I don't remember," he admitted quietly. The words hung in the air, raw and unguarded. Claire felt something shift in her chest, a strange mix of sorrow and understanding. She didn't pity him. That wasn't it. She simply saw him. Not the ruthless CEO, not the billionaire everyone feared, but a man who had forgotten how to be human. "You could remember," she said softly. "If you let yourself—" Jonathan looked at her for a long time, his eyes unreadable. Then he turned back to his laptop, as if retreating behind the familiar fortress of work. "You should get some sleep." "Miss Anderson," he said. His voice was cool again, but not quite as sharp as before. Claire stood, picking up her charger. At the door, she paused, glancing back at him. His head was bent over the papers, but his shoulders slumped ever so slightly. For the first time, she didn't see Jonathan Hale the untouchable. She saw Jonathan Hale the man lonely, exhausted, and utterly unaware of how badly he needed someone to remind him he was alive. "Good night, Jonathan," she said quietly. He didn't look up, but after a beat, he murmured, "Good night." Claire stepped into the darkened hallway, the sound of the city faint below. She knew then that something had changed. Not much, not enough to soften his ruthless edge, but just enough to reveal a crack in the armor. And sometimes, the smallest cracks were where the light got in. The streets of Queens were quiet on the weeknight, neon signs buzzing faintly in the damp air. Claire led the way, her heels clicking on the sidewalk, Jonathan trailing behind with the wary hesitation of someone who'd never set foot outside his carefully curated world. At the corner, a red neon sign flickered above a squat building with chrome trim and big windows, Rosie's Diner. The words, "Best Coffee in the Boroughs," glowed in blue beneath it. A bell jingled cheerfully as Claire pushed open the door. Jonathan paused at the threshold, frowning as though she had just taken him to Mars. "This is your idea of, what exactly, food?" Claire said firmly. "Real food. Not sushi delivered in little plastic trays while you sign contracts. Sit down. You'll survive." Inside, the diner was warm and worn in. Red vinyl booths lined the walls. The black and white checkered floor scuffed from decades of use. A jukebox stood in the corner, dusty but still flashing its colored lights. The air smelled of frying bacon, brewed coffee, and something sweet apple pie cooling behind the counter. A woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a bun looked up from the register. Her face lit up. "Claire, honey, it's been a while." Claire smiled, her voice softening. "Hi, Rosie. I brought a friend." Rosie's sharp eyes landed on Jonathan, taking in the expensive suit, the watch worth more than the diner's monthly revenue. "Wall Street," she said matter-of-factly. "Something like that," Jonathan muttered. "Well, any friend of Claire's is a friend of mine. Booth in the back, coffee's fresh." They slid into a corner booth. Jonathan shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to the cracked vinyl seat or the laminated menu Rosie dropped in front of them. He lifted the menu with 2 fingers as though it might bite him. Claire grinned. "Don't worry. None of it requires a business degree to understand." Meatloaf, burgers, pancakes, the kind of food people eat when they actually want to taste something. Jonathan arched a brow. "Do you always insult people when you take them out to dinner? Only billionaires who think sashimi counts as a personality," she shot back. For a moment, he looked startled and then, unexpectedly, he smiled. Not the razor-sharp smile of the boardroom, but something smaller, almost genuine. Rosie appeared with 2 mugs of steaming coffee. She set them down with a wink. "The pie's fresh. You'll want a slice." Jonathan eyed the mug suspiciously, then took a sip, He blinked. This is not terrible. Claire laughed. High praise from the king of $12 espressos. As they ordered, Claire choosing the meatloaf special, Jonathan reluctantly agreeing to a burger, the atmosphere settled. The din of clinking dishes, low conversation, and the hum of the jukebox wrapped around them. Claire leaned back, watching Jonathan scan the diner with a kind of cautious curiosity. "You really never come to places like this?" she asked. "I don't have time," he said simply. Or, "You don't allow yourself time." His eyes flicked to hers, sharp again, but softened when he looked away. "When I was younger, I used to play piano." Claire sat up. "You piano." He nodded once. "Classical. My mother insisted. I was good. My teacher said I had a natural ear." He paused, staring into his coffee. "But music doesn't pay bills. It doesn't keep companies alive. My father told me art was a luxury for people who could afford to fail." The words landed heavy between them. Claire felt a rush of anger on behalf of the younger Jonathan, the boy who had given up music because someone told him survival mattered more than beauty. "That's horrible," she said quietly. "It's realistic." His tone was clipped, as though he were repeating something he had convinced himself of many times. "The world doesn't owe anyone a living just because they can play Chopin." "Maybe not," Claire said, her voice firm. "But the world is a lot less beautiful without people who can—" Jonathan's gaze lifted to hers. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he leaned back, his expression unreadable. "You really believe that I believe that the things that make us human art, music, creativity aren't luxuries. They're necessities. Without them, we're just machines chasing profit margins." Rosie arrived with their plates, breaking the tension, a heavy slice of meatloaf with mashed potatoes for Claire, a cheeseburger with fries for Jonathan. He stared at his plate as though unsure how to approach it. "Don't overthink it," Claire said, cutting into her meatloaf. "It's food, not a quarterly report." He picked up the burger, took a cautious bite, and stopped. Chewed, took another bite, then another. "It's surprisingly good," he admitted. Claire grinned. "See, poor people have been making delicious food for centuries. We just don't hire marketing firms to dress it up with gold flakes and buzzwords." For the first time, Jonathan laughed. It wasn't polished or rehearsed. It slipped out, genuine and startled, as though he had forgotten the sound. Claire's chest tightened at the sound. She hadn't realized how badly he needed it until now. As they ate, their conversation drifted small things at first, then deeper currents. Claire told him about growing up in upstate New York, about her father teaching her to fish in the summers and her mother's habit of humming while she baked. Jonathan listened intently, occasionally asking questions, as though her stories were a foreign language he was determined to learn. In return, he admitted that his childhood had been shaped less by warmth and more by expectation. Lessons, schedules, achievement, no room for mistakes, no room for frivolity. "I learned early," he said quietly, "that if I wanted to matter, I had to win." Claire set down her fork, her voice soft but steady. "Maybe you don't have to keep winning. Maybe you just have to live." Jonathan didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted toward the jukebox in the corner, where an old Sinatra song had begun to play. For the briefest moment, she thought she saw a flicker of longing in his expression, as though he could hear echoes of the boy who once played piano. Rosie came by with 2 slices of apple pie, placing them on the table without waiting for their order. "On the house," she said with a wink. Jonathan looked down at the flaky crust, the filling glistening with cinnamon and sugar. He picked up his fork, tasted it, and closed his eyes for a beat. When he opened them, something in his face had softened. By the time they left Rosie's, the streets were even quieter. The neon sign buzzed above them, casting red light onto the sidewalk. Jonathan stood for a moment, hands in his pockets, gazing back at the diner. "You're right," he said finally. "It wasn't terrible." Claire rolled her eyes but smiled. "Careful, Jonathan?" That almost sounded like gratitude. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable, but his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "Thank you." It was only 2 words, But for Jonathan Hale, they were monumental. The elevator doors opened onto the hushed executive floor of Hale Tower, the kind of silence that hummed with tension. Clare followed Jonathan into the glass-walled conference room where Edward Price, his long-serving assistant, was waiting. Edward stood tall, his graying hair combed neatly, his hands folded behind his back. "Sir," Edward began without preamble. "We have a problem." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "We always have problems." "Edward, be specific." Edward slid a folder across the table. "It's Michael Carter." The name cut through the air like a blade. Jonathan froze, his hand resting on the folder, but not opening it. For the first time, Clare saw something flicker in his expression. Not anger, not annoyance, but something raw. "Who's Michael Carter?" she asked carefully. Glancing between them, Jonathan didn't answer. Edward did, his half-brother. Clare blinked. "You have a half-brother." Jonathan's voice was flat. "Had" would be more accurate. Edward shook his head. "No, sir. He's very much alive. And he's been busy." Clare leaned forward as Edward spread the documents across the mahogany table charts. Shareholder lists, lines of transactions. Michael has been quietly acquiring shares of Hale Global through shell companies. As of this morning, his holdings amount to just over 30%. Clare's stomach dropped. 30%. That's enormous. Edward nodded gravely. Enough to mount a serious challenge if he pushes for control, especially if he convinces other shareholders to align with him. Jonathan's face was unreadable, but Clare could see the way his fingers tapped once against the table. A nervous tick he probably didn't realize he had. "Why now?" she asked. "Because timing is everything," Edward replied. "The Morrison acquisition left us stretched thin. Michael knows that. He's waited for the moment when Jonathan appears most vulnerable." Jonathan finally spoke, his voice low. "This isn't about vulnerability. It's about revenge." Clare turned to him. "Revenge for what?" For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer, but then Jonathan exhaled, his shoulders stiff. "My father left everything to me. Michael's mother got nothing. He's been chasing shadows ever since," Edward added quietly. "Michael spent years dismantling companies for profit. Ruthless, efficient. He doesn't build. He strips. He's made a fortune by leaving wreckage behind." The words landed like stones in Clare's chest. She thought back to Jonathan in Rosie's diner, confessing that he once played piano, admitting that his father had preached survival over beauty. Now she saw the wound underneath the fracture that had shaped his life. "This isn't just business," Clare murmured. "It's family." Jonathan's gaze snapped to hers, steel blue eyes sharp. "Michael Carter is not my family. He never was. He's a rival, nothing more." But his voice betrayed him. It was too hard, too fast. Clare recognized the tone of someone trying to convince themselves. Edward cleared his throat, bringing the conversation back to strategy. "Sir, Santiago Group failed in their hostile bid because Clare reframed the narrative. But Michael won't play the same game. He knows your weaknesses, he knows how you think, and he's patient." Clare felt the weight of Edward's words settle on her shoulders. She glanced at Jonathan, whose face was a perfect mask again, but underneath, she saw the cracks the same man who had admitted, late at night, that his penthouse was as empty at 11 p.m. As it was at 7 "Jonathan," she said softly, "you don't have to fight this alone." He looked at her sharply, as though her words were dangerous. "Don't confuse empathy with strategy. Clare, he's not coming after me because of some brotherly grudge. He's coming because Hale Global represents everything he thinks was stolen from him." Clare didn't back down, and that makes it personal, which means we need more than numbers on a spreadsheet. We need people, stories, the truth. Edward gave a small nod, his eyes thoughtful. "She's right, sir. Shareholders will listen to Carter's promise of quick profit, but they might resist if they're reminded of what Hale Global has built, if they're reminded of the lives tied to this company." Jonathan pressed his palms flat against the table, leaning forward. His voice was calm, but Clare could hear the storm under the surface. Michael Carter doesn't care about lives. He never has. He cares about proving that he was wronged, and he'll burn down everything I've built to do it. The room fell silent. For the first time since she'd stepped into Hale Tower, Clare saw Jonathan not as the unshakable titan of Wall Street, but as a man staring down a ghost he could never quite escape. Her heart clenched. She wanted to reach across the table, to steady his hand, to tell him that family wounds didn't have to dictate the future. But she also knew Jonathan Hale wasn't a man who welcomed comfort. Instead, she spoke with quiet conviction. Then we fight him. Not just with strategy, not just with profits, but with something he doesn't understand. We fight with heart. Jonathan's eyes held hers for a long moment. He didn't agree. He didn't argue. But the fact that he didn't dismiss her outright told her more than words ever could. Edward closed the folder. "We should prepare, sir. Carter won't stay in the shadows for long. He's building momentum. It's only a matter of time before he makes his move." Jonathan straightened, his mask sliding fully back into place. Then let him come. But when he turned toward the window, the Manhattan skyline glittering like cold fire beyond the glass, Clare wondered if he believed his own words. Because for all his brilliance, for all his power, Jonathan Hale was still a man carrying the shadow of a brother who wanted to destroy him. And now, that shadow was closer than ever. The sun had risen and set 3 times since Jonathan Hale last closed his eyes. The executive floor of Hale Tower, normally pristine, had taken on the look of a battlefield. Empty coffee cups lined the desk. Papers were spread across every surface, and the faint smell of stale energy drinks lingered in the air. Jonathan stood hunched over a spreadsheet, his shirt rumpled, his tie discarded hours ago. His eyes, normally sharp as cut glass, were bloodshot. His hands trembled faintly as he typed. Clare leaned against the doorway, watching him in silence. She had counted 72 hours without rest. It wasn't stamina anymore. It was stubbornness bordering on self-destruction. "Jonathan," she said finally, her voice steady but soft, "you need to stop." He didn't look up. "I can't. Carter's making moves. If I don't counter them in real time, everything slips." "You're not a machine," Clare shot back. "You can't keep this up." His fingers stilled on the keyboard. Slowly, he lifted his head, steel blue eyes flashing. "You think I have the luxury of stopping 20,000 employees? Clare, 20,000 families. They don't get to stop when they have mortgages and bills. Why should I?" She crossed the room, standing on the other side of the desk. "Because you're about to collapse. And when you do, there won't be a company left for anyone to fight over." He slammed his hand on the table, making the papers jump. "Don't lecture me about collapse. I've held this company together since I was 25 years old. Do you think Carter would hesitate for a second to burn it down? He's circling, waiting for weakness. And you want me to nap." Clare flinched at the fury in his tone, but she didn't back down. "I want you to survive. Is that really so unreasonable for a moment?" Silence stretched between them, heavy and brittle. Then Jonathan turned away, bracing his hands against the glass window that overlooked Manhattan. His shoulders rose and fell with shallow breaths. "I can't stop," he said quietly. "If I stop, he wins." Clare's chest tightened. This wasn't about spreadsheets or shareholders. This was about the ghost of Michael Carter, the wound that had never healed. "Jonathan," she said softly, stepping closer, "you can't fight him if you're dead on your feet." He let out a harsh laugh. "I don't need sympathy." "It's not sympathy," Clare snapped. "It's reality. You're not invincible, no matter how much you want to be." He spun around, eyes blazing. "Then leave. Clare, if you can't stomach the way I fight, walk out that door. No one's forcing you to stay." The words hit like a slap. Clare's breath caught in her throat. "Leave." The temptation surged hot and sudden. She could walk away, go back to her Brooklyn apartment, patch her life together, find some job, any job that didn't involve watching a man destroy himself in slow motion. She imagined packing up her life in cardboard boxes, retreating into anonymity. It would be safer, easier. But then she remembered Rosie's diner, Jonathan's startled laugh over apple pie, the way his voice had trembled when he admitted he couldn't remember the last time he had truly laughed. The man who had once played piano before the world taught him that beauty was weakness. She wasn't looking at a ruthless CEO now. She was looking at a man fraying at the edges, terrified of losing not just his company, but himself. "I should leave," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Jonathan froze, the fire in his eyes dimming to something more fragile. "Then why don't you—" Claire swallowed hard. "Because you don't just need someone to fight Carter with you. You need someone to remind you that you're human." He stared at her, and for the first time in days, his mask cracked. His voice was hoarse. "And what if being human costs me everything?" Claire's throat tightened. "Then at least you'll still be you, and not some hollow shell Carter can destroy with a single strike." The silence that followed was deafening. Outside the glass walls, the city pulsed with life cars, sirens, the hum of survival. Inside, two people stood locked in a battle that had nothing to do with balance sheets and everything to do with the weight of being alive. Finally, Jonathan sagged against the window, his exhaustion undeniable. His hand rose, rubbing his temple as though even his thoughts had grown heavy. "You don't understand?" "Claire," he murmured, "I can't afford weakness." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Rest isn't weakness. It's strategy. Even generals sleep before battle." For a long moment, Jonathan didn't move. Then, slowly, he turned toward her. His eyes, weary and haunted, met hers. "If I let go just for a moment, promise me you won't." Claire felt the weight of the request press into her chest. He wasn't just asking her to keep the company afloat. He was asking her to keep him afloat. "I promise," she said quietly. Something in his expression softened. His shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him all at once. For the first time in 72 hours, Jonathan Hale allowed himself to sit. Claire exhaled, her own chest aching with relief and fear. She didn't know how long she could keep this up, supporting him, challenging him, holding the line between brilliance and madness. But for now, at least, he had let her in, and that was enough. The city skyline glittered against the darkening sky, a million lights flickering like restless thoughts. Jonathan stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse, his reflection superimposed on the view. His posture was rigid, hands shoved into his pockets, jaw set, as though holding back words that threatened to break free. Claire sat on the sofa, her legs curled beneath her, watching him in silence. She had learned that Jonathan never revealed anything easily. You had to wait until the armor cracked. Tonight. It finally did. "Do you know what it means?" he said quietly. "To be chosen for something you never asked for." His voice was low, almost lost in the hum of the city below. Claire hesitated. Chosen. He turned, and, for once, his expression wasn't cold or sharp. It was haunted. "When my father died, the lawyers read the will. Everything, every share, every building, every brick of Hale Global came to me. Michael and his mother received nothing. Not a cent." Claire's brows knitted. Why Jonathan let out a bitter laugh. "Because I was the son of the wife, the legitimate heir, the golden child." He shook his head. "Do you know what that does to a boy? To realize the only reason you have a future is because of a technicality of birth, that you're not special, you're just legal." Claire's heart clenched. "You were a child. That wasn't your fault." He looked at her sharply. "Try telling Michael that. He spent his whole life being reminded that he was the mistake. And he broke off, turning back to the window. "I became the prize he was denied." The silence between them grew heavy, filled with unsaid things. Claire rose, crossing the room slowly. "So, all of this your drive, Your obsession. It's because you've been afraid of losing what you never felt you deserved. Jonathan's shoulders stiffened. Afraid, he repeated, the word tasting bitter, no, determined. Determined not to squander what was handed to me. Determined to prove I earned it, even if I never asked for it. His hand tightened into a fist at his side. But every time I close my eyes, I hear his voice, telling me it should have been him, that everything I touch is stolen. Claire swallowed. She had seen Jonathan ruthless in the boardroom, untouchable in negotiations. But now she saw the truth underneath it all. He was a man terrified of being unworthy. You carry guilt that was never yours, she said gently. He whirled on her, his eyes blazing. Don't you dare call it guilt. It's responsibility. I inherited Hale Global. That means I bear the weight of 20,000 livelihoods. I can't falter. I can't rest. Because the moment I do, Michael will take it all and prove what I've feared all along. Claire's chest ached. That you don't deserve it. The words hung in the air like a knife. Jonathan didn't deny them. He turned away, his silence answer enough. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. Jonathan, being chosen doesn't mean you're unworthy. It means you were given a burden no one should have to carry alone. You've mistaken survival for purpose. That's what's destroying you. His laugh was sharp, hollow. Purpose is a luxury, Claire. My life has never been about what I want. It's about what I have to protect. And who protects you? She asked softly. He froze. His eyes flicked to hers. And for a moment, she thought she saw something raw longing, maybe, or despair. Then the mask slid back into place. The CEO once more. No one, he said flatly. That's the cost of being the one who's chosen. Claire's breath caught. She wanted to reach out, to take his hand, to tell him that he wasn't alone anymore. But a knot of fear twisted in her stomach. Because what if he couldn't see it? What if the fortress he had built around his heart was too strong for even her to breach? She thought back to Rosie's diner, to the way he had smiled, really smiled for the first time in years. She thought of his confession that he once played piano, that he had traded beauty for survival, and she wondered if that boy was still somewhere inside him, waiting to be freed, or if Michael's shadow had buried him for good. Jonathan's voice broke into her thoughts, softer now. Do you know why I never talk about him? About Michael? Claire shook her head. Because every time I do, I feel like that angry boy is standing in front of me again, and I know his voice faltered. He swallowed hard. I know that if I ever stop fighting him, I'll become him. Claire's throat tightened. She saw it now. Clearer than ever, Jonathan Hale wasn't just battling a rival. He was battling himself, the part of him that believed he was a fraud, a thief, an imposter living on borrowed time. And she was terrified, because she didn't know if love or compassion or even truth was enough to save him from that. She stepped forward anyway, her hand brushing against his sleeve. Jonathan, you're not Michael, and you never will be. But if you keep letting him live rent-free inside your head, he'll win before the boardroom battle even begins. His eyes closed briefly, as though her words pierced too deeply. When he opened them again, there was no answer, only silence. Claire exhaled, a quiet ache filling her chest. She wanted to believe he could fight this war without destroying himself. But as she looked at him, tired, haunted, unyielding, she feared that the greatest threat to Jonathan Hale wasn't Michael Carter, it was Jonathan himself. The announcement hit Hale Tower like a thunderclap. Michael Carter had filed the paperwork, formally calling for a shareholder vote to challenge Jonathan Hale's control of Hale Global. The date was set 3 weeks. The message was clear. This wasn't rumor anymore. It was war. Jonathan sat at the head of the boardroom table, his shoulders squared, his face a mask of determination. Around him, executives murmured in tense whispers, the fear in the room almost palpable. Claire sat 2 seats away, watching the man who had spent 72 sleepless hours preparing for this moment. His composure was perfect, but she knew better. Behind his calm eyes, the storm was raging. Edward Price stood, tablet in hand. Michael has consolidated 35% of the shares. He's courting another 10 through proxy agreements. If he succeeds, he'll have a majority. He's promising higher dividends, aggressive asset liquidation, and a leaner, more profitable company. Translation, Jonathan said dryly. He's offering them blood money. A nervous chuckle rippled around the table, but no one looked reassured. Claire leaned forward. Then we don't fight him on his terms. Jonathan's eyes flicked to her, meaning she met his gaze steadily. We can't outbid him. We can't promise higher dividends without gutting what makes Hale Global matter. If this is about numbers, we lose. But if it's about people, about lives, we might stand a chance. One of the board members frowned. People don't win votes. Shares do. Shares belong to people, Claire countered. Doctors, families, entrepreneurs. People who invested in this company because it meant something to them, once. Michael sees numbers. Jonathan, you've only ever let yourself see numbers, but I've seen the stories behind them. That's where we fight. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Jonathan. He sat back, steepling his fingers beneath his chin, his gaze sharp on her. And what exactly do you propose? Claire. She drew in a breath, steadying her voice. We reach out, not with press releases, not with corporate jargon, but with real conversations. We remind shareholders why they trusted Hale Global, not because of balance sheets, but because this company once stood for something bigger than profit. Jonathan's expression hardened. And if they don't care about that anymore, then at least we'll know we fought for something worth saving. Claire shot back. A muscle jumped in his jaw. He hated uncertainty. He hated risk. And this was both. Edward cleared his throat. Sir, Michael's path is clear. Ruthless efficiency, rapid returns. If Claire's right, and we can remind shareholders of the broader mission, it could create doubt, enough to sway the vote. Jonathan looked back at Claire, his eyes piercing. You think heart beats profit? I think heart reminds people what profit is for, she said softly. The silence stretched, heavy as stone. Jonathan could shut it down. He could dismiss her, retreat to the safety of numbers. That was the Jonathan Hale the world knew. Instead, after a long pause, he exhaled. Fine. You want a stage. You've got it. But if this fails, Claire, understand something. He leaned forward, voice low, sharp as a blade. You'll fall with me. Carter won't just burn me. He'll burn anyone who stood at my side. Claire's pulse quickened, but her chin lifted. Then I guess we burn together. Or we fight together. For the first time, Jonathan didn't argue. His gaze lingered on hers, unreadable but intense, before he turned back to the room. Edward, assemble the shareholder lists. Marcus, coordinate communications. We're not just presenting a financial defense, we're building a campaign. The executives exchanged startled glances. This was uncharted territory. Hale Global had always fought with balance sheets and projections, not personal appeals, but no one dared to object. As the meeting adjourned, Claire lingered, gathering her notes. Jonathan remained seated, staring at the city beyond the glass walls. She approached cautiously. You're really going to let me try? He didn't look at her. I don't have to like the idea to admit I don't have better options. Claire smiled faintly. That's almost a compliment. His eyes shifted to hers finally, weary but unwavering. Don't mistake this for trust. But she saw it anyway, the flicker of something new. A crack in the fortress. Later, in her Brooklyn apartment. Claire spread the shareholder files across her kitchen table. Names, addresses, histories. But she didn't just see data. She saw Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who had invested after Hale Global funded her cancer research project. She saw the Patterson family, whose factory had survived a recession because Jonathan's company had extended them a contract. She saw Margaret Ellison, who had launched her small business thanks to a microloan program Hale had funded. Stories, faces, lives. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jonathan. Midnight strategy call. Be ready. She sighed, rubbing her temples. He still thought like a general planning troop movements. But she knew the real battle wouldn't be fought in conference rooms. It would be fought in hearts. As she scribbled notes, her mind drifted. Jonathan had agreed to let her try, but how much faith did he actually have in her? And worse, how much of himself did he have left to give? Because she could see it, the strain in his face, the weight he carried like a curse. He was prepared to burn himself to ashes if it meant keeping Hale Global out of Michael's hands. And Clare. God help her, wasn't sure she could watch him do it. She pressed her pen against the paper, steadying her thoughts. She had made her choice the night she told him she wouldn't walk away. Now, she would prove it. Jonathan Hale believed numbers ruled the world. Michael Carter believed destruction was profitable. But Clare Anderson was about to show them both that people, in the end, were stronger than either. The conference hall of Hale Tower had been transformed into something that felt more like a tribunal than a shareholder meeting. Rows of chairs filled with investors, board members, and executives faced the long, polished table where Jonathan Hale sat at the head. The tension in the air was thick, every whispered conversation sharp with anticipation. At the far end, a massive screen displayed the faces of shareholders who had joined virtually from around the globe. Each of them held the power to determine Hale Global's future. Michael Carter had spoken first, his words slick, persuasive, dangerous. He painted Jonathan as an outdated tyrant clinging to control. He promised modernization, efficiency, and profitability, though everyone knew what that meant: gutting programs, firing workers, stripping the company bare. The room had listened, some had nodded. Michael knew how to dangle temptation in front of those who thought only in terms of quarterly gains. Now it was Jonathan's turn. He rose slowly, commanding the room with nothing more than his presence. His speech was measured, filled with numbers, projections, and logic. He spoke of sustainability, long-term growth, and the danger of short-sighted greed. It was brilliant, yes, but sterile. The kind of brilliance that made heads nod, but not hearts move. When he sat back down, the silence in the room was deafening. Claire's hands trembled in her lap. She hadn't planned to speak. She wasn't an executive, wasn't on the board, wasn't anyone who technically belonged in this room, but she could feel it. The tide hadn't turned. Michael's promises still hung in the air like poison. Jonathan's logic hadn't been enough. She stood. The scrape of her chair echoed like a gunshot. Dozens of heads swiveled toward her. Even Jonathan looked startled. "Miss Anderson," the board chair said, eyebrows arched. "This isn't regular protocol." "Then maybe protocol is the problem," Clare said, her voice stronger than she felt. The chair hesitated, then gestured. "Go ahead." Clare walked to the front of the room. Her knees shook with each step, but her chin remained high. She turned, facing the crowd. Her reflection multiplied on the giant screens. She took a breath, and then she told the truth. 3 months ago, she began. I was unemployed, humiliated, angry. I had just lost my job because of an acquisition that Jonathan Hale orchestrated. A ripple went through the room. Jonathan stiffened in his chair. "I blamed him for everything," she continued. "For destroying my career, for taking away my stability, for being the kind of man who looked at lives as numbers on a balance sheet. And in a moment of anger, foolish, reckless anger, I called him what I thought he was: heartless, incompetent. I said it in the lobby of this very tower, in front of dozens of witnesses. Some shareholders leaned forward, intrigued. Others exchanged glances. This was not the speech anyone had expected. Claire's voice faltered for a moment, but she steadied it. He could have ruined me for that. And believe me, he threatened to, but instead, he hired me. He gave me 3 months to prove that business could be done with heart. And I took that challenge, because I didn't have a choice. But what I discovered was that neither did he." Her throat tightened, but she pushed on. "Jonathan Hale is not incompetent. He's brilliant. He's the sharpest mind I've ever seen in a boardroom. But brilliance alone isn't enough. What I saw behind the late nights, the endless meetings, the the ruthless deals, was a man terrified of failing the people who depend on him. A man who hasn't rested in years because he carries 20,000 families on his back. A man who gave up music as a boy because someone told him survival mattered more than beauty. And yet, in every choice he makes for this company, he is still chasing something beautiful, something that lasts. She paused, scanning the room. Some shareholders were leaning forward now, their skepticism softening into something else. You've heard Michael Carter promise profit. And yes, profit is tempting. But let me tell you what Hale Global really is. It's Dr. Sarah Mitchell's cancer research that saves lives. It's the Patterson family's factory that kept its doors open during a recession. It's Margaret Ellison's small business initiative that gave hundreds of entrepreneurs a chance to build their dreams. It's programs that don't just fill bank accounts, they change lives. Her voice grew stronger with every word. I've seen Jonathan make cold decisions. I've argued with him, yelled at him, cursed him. But I've also seen him sit in his office at midnight, eyes bloodshot, still working because he refuses to let one more person lose a job on his watch. I've seen him laugh for the first time in years over pie at Rosie's Diner. I've seen him remember what it means to be human. And I stand here to tell you, this man has a heart. And if you give him this company, if you trust him with it, he will not just protect your investment, he will protect your legacy. For a moment, the room was utterly still. Claire's heart hammered against her ribs. Then, slowly, applause began. First one set of hands, then another, until the sound swelled, echoing off the high ceilings. Jonathan's expression was unreadable, but his eyes, those cold steel blue eyes, shone with something she had never seen before. Gratitude. And something else that made her chest tighten. Hope. Michael Carter sat stone-faced, his jaw tight. His polished promises suddenly looked hollow against Claire's raw truth. She stepped back, her knees trembling, and returned to her seat. Jonathan leaned slightly toward her, his voice low enough for only her to hear. You just risked everything, he murmured. Claire managed a faint smile. So did you. That's why it worked. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe they might actually win. The shareholder meeting had ended hours ago, but the adrenaline still pulsed in Jonathan's veins. Hale Tower's upper floors were nearly deserted, the usual hum of assistants and executives replaced by an uncanny stillness. Jonathan stood in his office, his suit jacket discarded, his tie hanging loose. The city stretched beneath him like a glittering web of light, but tonight it felt less like something he ruled and more like something that threatened to swallow him whole. Claire entered quietly, holding 2 mugs of coffee from the machine down the hall. She set one on his desk, watching him in silence. You didn't have to do that, he said, his voice rough. Neither did you, she countered gently. He looked up, confusion flickering across his tired face. You let me speak, she said. You let me take the floor in front of your shareholders. Jonathan Hale doesn't share his stage, not with anyone. But you did. His lips curved faintly. And you nearly set the place on fire. It needed burning, she said simply. For a long moment, the only sound was the muted hum of traffic far below. Then Jonathan set his coffee down, his shoulders sinking as though the weight he carried had finally grown too heavy to bear. My father used to say, he began slowly, that weakness is nothing more than failing to want victory badly enough. He believed the world was divided into winners and losers, nothing in between. You either conquered or you were conquered. Claire stayed quiet, sensing that if she interrupted, he might retreat behind his walls again. I was 8, he continued, his gaze fixed on the window. 8 years old when he put a stack of contracts in front of me and told me to memorize them. While other kids were playing baseball, I was learning liability clauses. By 10, I knew the difference between arbitration and litigation. By 12, he had me sitting in on meetings, watching him crush grown men into silence. His voice faltered. He swallowed hard. Do you know what that does to a boy? To grow up never being allowed to fail, to have every mistake carved into you like proof that you weren't strong enough. Claire's throat tightened. Jonathan? He turned then, his eyes raw. I've lived every day since he died, terrified that he was right, that if I faltered, if I cared too much, if I let anyone see my humanity, it would all collapse, that Hale Global would fall, that Michael would finally prove I was the fraud he always said I was. The words poured out now, a dam breaking, so I buried it all. The piano, the dreams, the softness. I built walls so high no one could climb them, and I told myself that was strength. Claire stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper, and now his jaw clenched, his breath shaky. Now I'm realizing that caring isn't weakness, that maybe the real weakness was convincing myself I could survive without it. The admission seemed to steal the air from the room. Jonathan pressed a hand against the window, his reflection fractured by the city lights. "When you stood up there today," he said hoarsely, "I wasn't afraid of losing the company. For the first time in my life, I was afraid of losing you." Claire's breath caught. The intensity in his words wrapped around her like fire. "I've faced boardrooms full of sharks," he continued. "I've stared down hostile takeovers, political threats, global markets collapsing. None of it scared me like the thought that you might walk away, that you might decide I wasn't worth the fight." His voice broke on the last word. He turned sharply, as if ashamed of his own vulnerability. But Claire reached out, placing a hand gently on his arm. "Jonathan," he froze, then looked down at her hand as though it were something foreign, something fragile he didn't know how to hold. "I'm still here," she said softly. "I chose to be here, and I'm not going anywhere." His eyes closed briefly, as though the weight of her words was almost unbearable. When he opened them again, they glistened with something he rarely allowed himself: tears. "You don't know what you've done to me, Claire Anderson," he whispered. "You've taken a man who thought caring was a liability and made him realize it's the only reason to fight at all." Claire's chest ached, but in the best way. She had seen him ruthless, cold, calculating. But this was Jonathan Hale stripped bare. A man who carried his father's ghost, his brother's hatred, and his own crushing fear, and finally admitted he couldn't carry it alone. For the first time, he didn't look like a titan of Wall Street. He looked like a man who had been fighting for far too long, who was finally ready to let someone fight beside him. She stepped closer, closing the space between them. "Then let me carry some of it," she whispered. His gaze locked onto hers, fierce and trembling. Slowly, he lifted his hand, cupping her face as though she might vanish. "Caring isn't weakness," he repeated, almost as if convincing himself. Then his voice dropped lower, raw. "But losing you would be—" The words hung in the air, trembling with the force of everything unspoken. Claire didn't answer with words. She simply pressed her forehead to his, her hand resting over his chest where his heart beat wildly. And for the first time in his life, Jonathan Hale let himself be vulnerable, not as a CEO, not as an heir, not as a man defined by inheritance or fear, but simply as himself. The grand boardroom of Hale Tower was so quiet, Claire could hear the faint tick of the antique clock on the wall. Moments before, the room had been filled with voices, arguments, questions, debates between shareholders and executives, but now, silence pressed down like a heavy curtain, all because of her. Her words still hung in the air. "I fell in love with him." She hadn't planned to say it. God. It wasn't part of the carefully orchestrated strategy she'd stayed up nights drafting. But when Dr. Patel had asked what had changed, why she now fought for Jonathan Hale instead of against him, the truth had burst out before she could stop herself. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Dozens of eyes stared at her gray-haired trustees clutching their pens, investors adjusting their glasses, assistants frozen mid-note. Every face was a mirror of shock. Across the table, Jonathan sat utterly still. His jaw was tight, his blue-gray eyes unreadable. The silence stretched so long, Claire feared she had ruined everything, that she had not only humiliated herself, but also destroyed his chance of holding the company. Her throat went dry. She wanted to take it back, to retreat, to pretend she hadn't just bared her heart in front of some of the most powerful people in New York, but her mother's voice echoed in her memory, steady and warm. The truth always costs something, Clare, but the lies cost more. So she lifted her chin. Yes, she said into the stillness. I fell in love with Jonathan Hale, not the billionaire, not the CEO, not the man the headlines call ruthless. I fell in love with the man who works himself to exhaustion because 20,000 families depend on him. The man who hasn't taken a vacation in years because he doesn't know how to stop protecting what he's built. The man who, her voice broke. She steadied it. The man who learned how to listen, who let someone challenge him, and instead of destroying her, he hired her. That's the man I know. That's the man I love. A soft gasp rippled through the room. A few of the shareholders exchanged startled looks. One elderly board member muttered something under his breath. But Clare didn't look away from Jonathan. He was the only one who mattered. For a heartbeat, 2, 3. He didn't move. He didn't speak. Claire's stomach twisted with dread. What if she'd misread everything? What if he didn't feel the same? Then Jonathan pushed back his chair and stood. He didn't look at the shareholders. He didn't look at the rows of lawyers, advisors, and analysts. He looked only at her. Do you know what you've just done? Clare Anderson, he asked, his voice low but carrying. Her breath caught. I told the truth. A flicker of something pain, awe, wonder crossed his face. Then he turned toward the room, straightening to his full height. For 3 months, he said, his tone stronger now. Clare has challenged me in ways no one else ever dared. She called me incompetent, heartless, arrogant. A nervous chuckle scattered across the room. And she was right, he continued, silencing them instantly. I had forgotten what it meant to be human. I thought success meant shutting down the very part of myself that cared. But she reminded me. She made me see that caring isn't weakness. It's the only strength that lasts. He looked back at her, his eyes burning. She says she fell in love with me, he said softly. But the truth is, I fell in love with her first. I just didn't know how to admit it. Not to her, not to myself. The room seemed to inhale all at once. Jonathan took a step closer to Clare, then another, until he stood beside her in front of the long mahogany table. His hand found hers without hesitation, his fingers curling around hers as if they had always belonged there. This woman, he said, lifting their joined hands slightly, is the reason I remembered how to be human. She's the reason I can stand here today and tell you that Hale Global is more than numbers on a balance sheet. It's people, it's heart. And if you believe this company deserves to survive, it's because of her courage to tell the truth, even when it could cost her everything. Clare felt tears sting her eyes. Around the room, she saw movement doctor, Patel nodding slowly, Margaret Ellison pressing her hand to her chest, even the skeptical Mr. Lawson lowering his gaze in thought. But what mattered most was Jonathan's hand in hers, warm and steady. She squeezed it, whispering, Jonathan. He leaned closer, his voice dropping so only she could hear. You saved me, Clare, not the company, me. The final walls around her heart crumbled. Whatever happened next, whether the shareholders voted for or against him, she knew one thing with certainty: she wasn't fighting alone anymore. The chairman cleared his throat awkwardly. Well, I suppose that settles any doubts about your partnership, he muttered, prompting a ripple of restrained laughter. But Jonathan didn't let go of her hand. He didn't retreat into polished speeches or strategic maneuvering. He stood openly, vulnerably, as a man who had just declared love in the most dangerous place he could, in the heart of his empire. The room would move on soon. There would be votes, numbers, negotiations, but for this moment, time bent around them. Clare thought of the first day, of calling him heartless in this very building. How impossible it seemed then that she would one day stand beside him, hand in hand, her love for him echoing off these marble walls. Jonathan lifted her hand to his lips, brushing a kiss across her knuckles. The gesture was so small, so intimate, it made her heart ache. "Whatever happens," he whispered, "you're my victory." The silence that followed was no longer cold. It was reverent, charged with the weight of something undeniable. Claire let herself breathe again, her fingers tightening in his. And for the first time since the war with Michael Carter began, she felt not just hope for the company, but certainty for her own heart. The boardroom had never felt heavier. The air itself seemed to weigh down on every chair, every document, every person seated around the polished mahogany table. Michael Carter stood at the far end, his tailored suit immaculate, his smile razor sharp. He looked like a man already savoring his victory. His eyes glinted as if he could already feel Hale Global slipping into his grasp. Jonathan Hale, by contrast, stood tall but silent, Clare at his side. Their hands were no longer joined, but the energy between them was undeniable. The echo of their public declarations still vibrated in the room. "All right," the chairman said, his voice strained. "We've heard the arguments. We've seen the numbers. Now it is time to vote." He cleared his throat, shuffling his papers nervously. "As you all know, control of Hale Global rests upon this decision. Do we hand the company over to Mr. Carter and his group, or do we continue under the leadership of Mr. Hale?" A ripple went through the room. This was no longer just about numbers or market projections. Claire could feel it. The shareholders weren't weighing balance sheets, they were weighing hearts. Michael's smile widened. He leaned casually against the table. "Let's be clear. I offer stability, profit, a guaranteed increase in shareholder returns. Mr. Hale offers sentiment, a company tied to his pride and his extracurricular relationships." His gaze darted toward Claire with disdain, a calculated barb meant to reduce her to a distraction. Claire's cheeks flushed, but before she could respond, Jonathan spoke. "Don't insult her," Jonathan said evenly. His voice wasn't raised, but the steel in it silenced the room. "Claire Anderson is the reason this company still has a chance. If you think she's a liability, you haven't been paying attention." Michael smirked. "Ah, yes. The Great Reformation, the ruthless Hale suddenly growing a conscience. Convenient timing." Jonathan didn't flinch. He faced the shareholders directly. "You've all seen what Santiago Group did to 17 companies. 17. Every one of them gutted, families displaced, programs destroyed, futures erased. Do you really think Michael Carter offers you stability? He offers you the illusion of it, and once he's stripped this place to the bone, you'll be left with nothing but numbers on a page." For the first time, Michael's expression faltered. Claire stepped forward, unable to hold back. "You've invested in Hale Global because somewhere along the way, this company touched your life. Maybe it was a program we funded. Maybe it was a job that gave your child a start. Maybe it was research that saved someone you love. That doesn't disappear because Michael waves a checkbook. Don't let him convince you profit is the only thing worth fighting for." The room shifted, faces softened, shoulders relaxed. Claire saw Dr. Patel exchange a look with Margaret Ellison, something unspoken passing between them. The chairman raised his hand. "It's time. We'll go around the table, one by one." The voices rang out. Dr. Patel. She adjusted her glasses. "I vote to retain Mr. Hale's leadership." Margaret Ellison, Mr. Hale, Mr. Lawson. A pause. He looked from Jonathan to Michael, then finally said, "Hale." Claire held her breath as the list continued, each name a small thunderclap in the storm. With every declaration for Jonathan, her chest loosened. With every one for Michael, her stomach tightened. Finally, the count neared completion. The chairman glanced at his papers, his brow furrowed. "That leaves us with a tie." A murmur erupted. Michael's smirk returned, and the deciding vote. The chairman continued, "Rests with Mrs. Whitmore." An elderly woman at the far end of the table, her white hair pinned neatly, leaned on her cane as she rose slowly. Every eye turned to her. "I've been with this company since your father's time," she said, her voice trembling but clear. I've watched it grow, falter, and grow again. I've seen what greed can do, and I've seen what happens when someone remembers why this place exists at all. She looked at Jonathan, then at Clare, her gaze softening. My vote, she said firmly, is for Mr. Hale. The room erupted. Relief washed through Clare so strongly her knees nearly buckled. Jonathan exhaled, long and ragged, as though he had been holding his breath for years. Michael's face twisted, his composure cracking. This isn't over, he hissed. You think you've won, but I'll be back. You can't hold this forever. Jonathan turned to him, his voice calm but final. You're right, Michael. I can't hold it forever. But what I can do is build something worth holding on to. That's the difference between us. Michael's jaw clenched, his hands fisting at his sides. For a moment, Clare thought he might lash out. But then he spun on his heel and stormed from the room, the echo of his footsteps fading down the marble hall. Silence lingered for a beat before the shareholders erupted into conversations, some relieved, others dazed. Clare turned to Jonathan. His face was unreadable for a moment, then slowly. He smiled, not the cold, predatory smile she'd once known, but something real. It's over, she whispered. No, he said, taking her hand. It's just beginning. She looked around at the shareholders, at the people who had chosen not just Jonathan, but a different kind of company. For the first time, Hale Global wasn't just surviving, it was transforming. Jonathan squeezed her hand, his voice low but certain. We're going to change this place. Clare. Not because of numbers, because of people. Tears stung her eyes, but she nodded. Together, the weight of the room lifted, replaced by something lighter. Hope. And as they stood in the heart of Hale Tower, Clare realized this vote hadn't just saved a company. It had saved Jonathan. It had saved them both. Rosie's diner was quieter than usual that night. The neon sign buzzed faintly against the glass, and the smell of bacon grease lingered in the air. A couple of taxi drivers nursed mugs of coffee at the counter, and an older man in a plaid shirt flipped through a worn newspaper. Clare and Jonathan slid into their booth in the corner, the same one they had claimed weeks ago. Dolores, the owner, spotted them and waved, her silver hair catching the light. 2 coffees, strong, she said knowingly, without even asking. And pie. You both look like you need pie. Clare smiled. Jonathan gave a small nod. Apple, he murmured, as though the word itself carried comfort. For the first time in months, maybe years, Jonathan Hale looked peaceful. The tightness that usually framed his mouth was gone, replaced by a softness Clare had rarely seen. His suit jacket was draped over the seat, his tie tucked into his pocket. Without the armor of his boardroom presence, he looked almost like an ordinary man. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, sipping coffee. Clare traced the rim of her mug with her finger, letting the quiet settle in her bones. You know, she said finally, I think this place has seen more turning points in your life than your office ever has. Jonathan arched a brow. Turning points. Here's where you admitted you used to play piano, where you realized food could have soul, where you... She paused, a blush creeping up her cheeks, where you stopped being the untouchable CEO and started being someone real. He leaned back, considering her words. Maybe you're right. Maybe Rosie's is more sacred than Hale Tower. Blasphemy. She teased. He smirked. Truth? Dolores returned with 2 plates of warm apple pie, the steam rising in curls. She set them down with a wink. On the house tonight. You both look like you've carried the weight of the world and finally set it down. Thank you, Clare said softly. Jonathan studied the pie for a long moment, then looked up at her. You saved me today. You saved yourself, she countered. I just reminded you what mattered. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. Clare, I don't know how to explain it, but for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm not fighting alone. Like I don't have to carry all of it myself. Her chest tightened. That's because you don't. They finished their pie slowly, the conversation meandering from trivial things, Dolores's habit of humming old jazz tunes, the taxi drivers arguing politics at the counter to heavier ones, the company, the programs they wanted to expand, the kind of leadership they wanted Hale Global to represent. When they finally left, Manhattan air wrapped around them, brisk and alive. Instead of calling a car, Jonathan simply took her hand and led her down the block. His stride was unhurried, his presence no longer looming, but grounding. At the penthouse, Claire slipped off her heels by the door, marveling at how natural it felt to enter his world now, no longer as an outsider or adversary, but as a partner. Jonathan moved toward the grand piano in the corner of his living room. For months, it had been nothing but decoration, a silent relic of a boyhood dream abandoned. Tonight, however, he lifted the lid with deliberate care. Claire watched as he sat down, his long fingers hovering above the keys, his shoulders tensed, then eased, slowly, almost uncertainly. He pressed a note, then another. The sound was tentative at first, fragile, like testing the ground after years away. But as he continued, the music grew steadier. A melody emerged, not polished, not perfect, but full of something far more important: emotion. Claire curled up on the couch, her chin resting on her knees, her eyes never leaving him. The sight of Jonathan Hale, the man who once seemed carved from stone, playing piano under the warm glow of his living room lamp, was almost too much. "You're good," she whispered when he paused. He shook his head. "I used to be better, but maybe that's not the point anymore. What is the point?" He looked at her, his eyes clear, open, to feel, to remember I'm alive, to share it with you. Her breath caught. He stood, crossing to her. She rose to meet him, and he pulled her into his arms. For a moment, they just stood there, the faint hum of the city beyond the windows, the lingering vibration of piano notes in the air. "This," he murmured against her hair, "is the new beginning." She pulled back enough to look into his face. "For you, for the company, for both, for us." Her smile trembled. "And what does it look like?" "Less fear," he said simply. "More heart." She kissed him then, a kiss that tasted of apple pie and hope, of everything they had survived and everything yet to come. When they broke apart, Jonathan rested his forehead against hers. "True competence," he whispered, "is not about perfection. It's about the courage to care." Claire closed her eyes, letting the words wash over her. They were the truest words she had ever heard. Outside, Manhattan glittered like a million promises. Inside, in the quiet of the penthouse, Jonathan Hale and Claire Anderson began their journey not as adversaries, not as employer and employee, but as two people who had found in each other what they never knew they were missing: a new beginning. At its heart, this story isn't just about billionaires, boardrooms, or battles for power. It is about something far more familiar to all of us: the struggle between fear and compassion. Jonathan Hale spent years believing that strength meant shutting out his heart. He built walls so high that even success felt empty. Claire Anderson, on the other hand, had lost almost everything, but she still held on to her belief that people matter more than profit. When their worlds collided, both were forced to ask, what does it truly mean to live well? The answer is not perfection. It is not winning every fight or never making mistakes. True competence, true success comes from the courage to care, even when it costs us something, to open our hearts, even when it feels safer to close them. For those of us who have lived through triumphs and losses, this lesson rings especially true. We are remembered not for the money we earned or the titles we carried, but for the people we touched, the kindness we showed, and the love we dared to give. In the end, caring is not weakness. It is our greatest strength. Thank you so much for spending your time with us and walking through this story of courage, love, and redemption. If it touched your heart, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it with a friend who might need a little inspiration today, and subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories. Your support means the world to us, and it's what keeps these stories alive. Until next time, take care, stay kind, and keep shining.